Hello, I'm Rose Jackson, the director of the Democracy and Tech Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. And I'm excited to be here today for a panel focusing on questions of technology and geopolitical competition and how that manifests throughout the world. I think part of why we're having this conversation is that technology has become ubiquitous in life. It's required for business, innovation, engaging with our friends and families, participating in democracy and forms of government, emergency response, and I could go on. And so it's no surprise that it has become one of the main spheres of geopolitical competition. However, in that context, you have kind of two competing models, increasingly, of norms and interconnected ways of operating. One is the long-standing tradition around a free, open, secure, and interoperable internet that requires there to be certain shared standards and practices. The other is a growing model that is often pushed by authoritarian countries, including China, that opts for a more sovereign control of an internet in which a state has the ability to set the rules and boundaries that breaks down the ability for interoperable approaches. While that geopolitical competition plays out at a higher level, often countries fall into a trap of treating the rest of the world as a domain of that competition, as opposed to countries in their own right with their own agency and interests. If you are approaching this conversation from the perspective of wishing to maintain a free, open, secure, and interoperable internet, something that certainly at the Digital Forensic Research Lab we endorse, then it becomes even more important to honestly assess the ways in which the rest of the world is walking into this conversation. And so in the midst of this conference that is focusing explicitly on questions of how, quote, the global south, increasingly called sometimes the global majority or G77, have their very own vested interests in walking into an increasingly digital world becomes a necessity for the success of democracy, of human rights, of innovation, competition, and open markets, and all of the things that I think here we wish to advance. So today, to have this conversation, we're lucky to be joined by a really interesting panel of experts. Four people that you're going to hear from momentarily, starting with Noor Luong, who is a non-resident fellow at the Global China Hub, also at the Atlantic Council, as well as a senior research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Noor focuses on China's science and technology ecosystem, including its approach to and development of AI and other emerging technologies. We also have Elina Noor, who's a senior fellow at the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on the impact of technology on power, governance, and nation building in Southeast Asia. We have Schroeder, who's a leading global venture capitalist with particular focus on emerging markets. Chris co-founded Next Billion Ventures and has a long record of leadership in business, innovation, and geopolitics. And finally, Conrad Tucker, who is the director of CMU-Africa, the Associate Dean for International Affairs Africa at the Carnegie Mellon University, and will be speaking to us today as well. So you don't want to hear from me. I want to get to this conversation. So perhaps I can throw out first for all the panelists a starting point of how are you seeing this geopolitical conversation that I think we can say, even from the US standpoint, from the Trump years to the Biden years, there seems to be a pretty significant focus on China in general and a context or conversation around it's China or the United States. Have you seen any meaningful change in how that conversation has been received or is manifesting in the parts of the world that you work in, and how countries are contending with that? Can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me today. And in my work, as you said, I do look a lot at Chinese S&T ecosystem, but also how China has been engaging with the rest of the world to meet its own ambitions in, for example, leadership in AI or 5G, and other technologies as well. And to answer your question, what we've been observing so far is, when it comes to US policies towards China, there's now a conversation about how do we first defend technologies from being used by the Chinese government for certain things, for example, human rights abuse or surveillance or for military purposes, anything that has to do with national security. How do we defend our technologies from being misused? But at the same time now, the other side of that policy is also more focused on how do we promote technology development within the United States, but also how do we increase more collaboration with allies and partners. And that includes the Global South, as you said, the Global 77, or the Global Majority, however we want to define that today.
But be a popcorn of references throughout our conversation.
Absolutely. So those are the two kind of policies that are working hand in hand. And I think, the conversation now is, especially we're seeing the Indo-Pacific strategy as well coming from the United States, that the United States cannot do this alone. Right, the competition with China, or in general, developing technologies for societal benefit, for economic development, for national security. All these three components are important to a nation, and we cannot do this alone. So we have to work to collaborate with other allies and partner countries that are also share the same interests.
Thank you. Perhaps I can turn next to Conrad Tucker, if you want to take that first question.
Great, and thank you for having me on the program. So our mission here in Africa, in Rwanda, is an education and capacity building mission. And what we're seeing is a misunderstanding of where, what is the role of academia as a neutral education mission body. So we currently have over 19 African countries represented in our student body. And a lot of what we do is the transformation of the inclusive digital transformation of Africa. Now, when you think about what that entails, it's a stack of technologies which include hardware, the networks that these technologies use to communicate, and also examples such as AI algorithms that are built on top of these networks. So when we talk about competition between China and the US, where do these different technologies fit on either side of the spectrum? And that sometimes puts universities in a very challenging position where we have students from all around the world. Our mission is to educate and disseminate content. Academia is known for a free flow of students and ideas, and once we start having these embargoes or constraints, how are we supposed to educate students, or what message are we supposed to be communicating in terms of their ability to collaborate freely across the world? So those are just some of the observations that we're experiencing here on the ground, and again, this is a very timely conversation to be having.
Thank you. Noor, perhaps you can also shed some light on how you're seeing this geopolitical dynamic and conversation, particularly the approach from the United States in focusing on China, how that's showing up, or if that's changed at all on the ground in the countries that you're working in.
Thanks, Rose. I'm going to assume that question was to me. Look, I work in Southeast Asia. I work on Southeast Asia as a Southeast Asian. I think it's a complex landscape, and depending on who you speak to, which countries you speak to, about what types of technology, it is going to render you very different answers. And I think this reductiveness that's been created by a geopolitical bifurcation of the tech landscape, primarily by the US and China, is causing quite a bit of anxiety on the ground in many countries in Southeast Asia. There are countries that are going to take advantage of this rivalry between the two powers, particularly in the semiconductor chip space. And you see that with Malaysia and Vietnam, for example, kind of surging ahead. The other countries trying to cash in on some of the developments taking place within the United States, such as the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, but also some of the onshoring efforts that are also being developed by the United States. But then I think in general, there is this unease about how this technological competition is going to play out in the long run, and what that means for interoperability of technologies in Southeast Asia, but also a harmonization of governance and policy frameworks that may or may not take place if the United States and China decide to go their own ways. I would also challenge this idea that there are only kind of two spheres of democracy and authoritarianism, because we're seeing this particularly with the Brussels effect, for example, in the data protection privacy space. There are norms that are being formulated and being explored by other countries such as India that are trying to kind of patch some kind of their own framework together. And this whole idea of, democracy on the one side and authoritarianism on the other side really doesn't sit well in a region like Southeast Asia.
Thank you. A lot for us to dive into off of that, but I first want to make sure, Chris, you can take this opening question as well. Curious how you're seeing the U.S. kind of focus on China and framing show up or change over time in the places that you've been working.
Well, firstly, let me add to the thanks for those of you in putting this together in the Atlantic Council and this phenomenal panel. I mean, in many respects, I'd rather just sit and listen to my compatriots here overall. I'm going to come at it just a little bit differently. It might be additive in two ways, and more from the bottom up with the look of entrepreneurs and the startup worlds generally. I mean, the first is, at one level, I hate the term Global South because it paints with such a broad brush, but the fact is in startups, there's a lot of truth in it. There's actually more shared in emerging markets among tech startups, I think, with among themselves than there is even with Silicon Valley. And China is a former emerging market, so they actually have a shared language in a way that's very powerful. Right before COVID, I actually spent some time in China with 17 very, very growth stage companies in fintech from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Nigeria, and they met with 70% of the conversation was the same, and almost none of it would have happened in Silicon Valley or New York. How do you navigate ever-changing regulation? How do you deal with complexity and logistics and moving things? How do you educate populations that use fintech, 70% of whom have never had a bank account? And so it was a really interesting shared dynamic that unifies them. And it leads to my second observation, because among the 100 things that I've gotten wrong in thinking about China and all this, is that I thought that this was indicating a huge wave of Chinese venture capital coming to emerging markets, and the evidence really isn't there right now. And so the question is why? And just a couple of observations to look at. I think, firstly, we just have to make a difference between venture capital and tech startups and then the huge juggernauts, because the huge juggernauts, particularly in infrastructure, are showing up massively. Huawei and the like have a very, very large plan, of course, across these markets overall. We all should be watching BYD very carefully right now because they are very specifically looking at countries with both proclivity, desire, and regulation pushing for adoption of EV and things like that. Early stage expansion into these markets initially was often about just reaching Chinese. Their WeChat really was focused not on making Brazilians using WeChat, but on the 20 million Chinese who were there to be able to use it. But at the same time, now WeChat has opened massive data centers in Singapore, not because they're just hedging their bets, as a lot of Americans think, but because they think that's a very good platform to be able to offer services globally overall. TikTok is kind of in a category of its own, and the big consumer players like Shein and all are trying to follow that playbook, I think, in a way. They all realize that America is a fantastic market if you can get there, but if it's blocked, the rest of the world's a pretty big place as well. And I think in the end, venture capital in China has been asking itself a very basic question. It's one of opportunity cost. Should I back a startup in Sao Paulo or Jakarta, or should I just go to a great entrepreneur that's doing something really powerful in a second, third city in China, which is just as large and maybe more understandable overall? Having said that, there is a tremendous amount of money that is being deployed among Chinese companies that look to market expansion, like the other ones that I mentioned before. They may not want to be involved in Brazil with a Brazilian startup as they did with Didi as much, but they certainly are looking at companies who want to invest and have global in the way that Alibaba has done, Shein has done. Temu is absolutely looking at all these companies, is already in dozens of actually developed countries. So that will keep playing. And the last observation really is, what does America play in all of this? And I think America has two sort of premises. One of it is particularly with technology like AI, like if there's a divide, that's fine by them. Like this is something that they look at as a divide and hard to find common ground. And secondly, there's a premise, particularly in Silicon Valley, that centralized plan innovation isn't a thing, and that they will still be competitive because of the dynamics that we've relied on in America for 20 or 30 years. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how much that actually plays out, particularly in AI, but in technology more broadly.
Thank you. So I want to dig into a few pieces of that. And let's maybe work our way down to actually doing what we said we wanted to in the beginning of taking countries on their own terms. And Noor, I wonder, picking up a little bit on something that Chris was just talking about, he's talking about the expectation that there would have been more venture capital or certain kinds of investment flowing from China into these places. You've done some work on kind of understanding the differences or realities of kind of the Chinese Chinese companies and the commercial sector, which some people will often conflate and make the assumption that any company out of China is essentially the Chinese government, which is of course not the case. But I'm curious if you could shed some light on how you're seeing that show up in some of these places, the role that Chinese companies are playing in both the advancement of Chinese strategies in these countries, but also kind of investments and engagement on their own terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to answer this question, first, I think we need to take a look at the relationship between Chinese companies and the PRC, just more broadly, and to take a look at how that actually plays out within China. And I do want to say this very, very clearly in the beginning that the relationship between these two entities are increasingly blurred. Obviously, there's definitely more aligned interests than we can imagine, or compared to Western companies and Western governments. But at the same time, I don't think we should over-index the amount of or the extent of which Chinese companies are influenced by the Chinese government. The relationship or the direction of influence goes both ways, right? The Chinese company can also lobby the Chinese government to also meet their own interests, their business interests. They are profit motivated. Even SOEs can also lobby the Chinese government to do certain to shape the policy. So the two directions are something to be noteworthy as well. That being said, when Chinese companies go abroad, and they are encouraged to go abroad, right? Chinese government has put out strategies, and we can clearly see that in the 2017 AI development plan that put out by the State Council. In that strategy, there's a section where the Chinese government is encouraging or has stated explicitly that Chinese companies, especially AI companies, should be going out and expand abroad in order to leverage other countries' capabilities. In a similar sense that companies are going abroad to expand to different markets, like Chris said, and also to take advantage of other countries' ecosystem. And so that is similar to what we see traditionally. And to Chris' points as well, there's a lot of Chinese money going abroad and expanding their market. But at the same time, in my research, when we talk about private sector investment and venture capital, private equity investment, there is less Chinese money in Southeast Asia. And there's actually more money coming from Chinese companies and Chinese venture capitalists in the United States, right? The United States is the most attractive destination because the AI market here is quite mature and more dynamic than other places. So that is something to be noting as well. But what's important in the future that I'm also tracking and moderating as well is that the more the U.S. is, put more restriction on Chinese capital flowing in and out of the United States, the more we might be able to see that, and this is the prediction, not to say that, this is highly speculative, but based on, trends that we see so far is that Chinese companies may be looking towards other places to invest. And to take advantage of, especially as the Chinese economy is slowing down, especially as, the United States is putting more restriction, when it comes to outbound investment screening, for example, we might see those trends coming up in the near future.
Thank you. Elina, I'm actually curious, picking up on that, the potential for increased investment, Chinese investment coming into the region, whether that's something you are seeing people kind of anticipating or trying to encourage, and also if you could speak to potentially even just like regionally. So looking at the role of ASEAN and how states together are navigating that, are you seeing just even in this innovation space a difference in how countries are trying to either approach opportunities for whether it's American venture capital investment or Chinese investment or frankly completely other sources? What is it looking like where you are?
I don't want to be crass, especially so early this morning on the west coast of the United States, but money is money, right? And so Southeast Asian countries are in this race to develop their economies, particularly coming out of COVID. And while there's been significant U.S. investment over at least 2 decades in the region, the U.S. remains one of the top 3, if not top 2, FDI partners for Southeast Asia. there's also increasingly a lot of Chinese investment coming in. I don't have the numbers on me, but it's clear that there are governments in Southeast Asia that are very keen on encouraging Chinese investment, both at the upstream level as well as the downstream level. You see this, for example, with Indonesia and the Philippines pitching their raw minerals for EV batteries, for example. There are already significant Chinese investors in mines, in nickel mines in Indonesia to make that happen. But again, I think for Southeast Asia, it's really about gaining investment, whether it's from Japan, Korea, the United States, or China, or anywhere else. And so there's an agnosticism about where the money comes from to a certain extent. The whole ideological baggage that is often imposed upon the region from the outside is not shared by governments in the region itself.
Thank you. Conrad, I wonder if I could take a slight tweak on this. So as you mentioned, you are leading a research and educational institution in Rwanda. And there's certainly been likewise investments both in bringing African students to China as well as investments in training and opportunities from China on the continent. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about how you're seeing China show up in the educational space and how that matches in some ways to some of the kind of pipeline work, development of skills and opportunities in the spaces that you're operating.
Thank you for the question. So two fronts. The first is access to software and services that we use in our education programs. It's no surprise why many firms either have reduced education pricing because the students then go on to become the managers, and then you have that pipeline and immediate connection to the technology. We're also seeing a lot of students. We're seeing some of our current students who are enrolled who got their undergrad or grad studies from China. And the question is the U.S. providing as many opportunities for African students to study in the U.S.? Or let's take the process of attaining visas, or the rate in which visas are denied to students. All of these contribute to the decisions as to where African students go in pursuit of their education. So I think there are a few tangible steps that we can take to establish more of a long-term relationship with African talent. It's not just a short-term transactional relationship, or at least in my opinion, it shouldn't be. And if we are successful in forming these long-term relationships, then when we think about the products, services, technologies that would be adopted across the continent, there may be an increased likelihood that that would be more U.S. leaning, because our students then become the technology leaders across the continent.
Thank you. It's an interesting framing to say, the competition conversation that we so often have is the idea of like markets between China and the United States, and reframing that to say competition over talent and people moving into these ecosystems is a useful frame. I guess in that context, Chris, I would love to hear a little bit more about, as you are looking for opportunities in many of these countries to support burgeoning startups and moving the investment opportunities forward, what do you think that people are missing about those opportunities, whether it is pathways to connections with other markets, educational opportunities, simply access to capital, et cetera? What are the opportunities taking many of the kind of innovators and businesses on their own terms in these countries? What are people missing?
I think in many respects, what is missing is even in your use of the word burgeoning, because in a lot of these markets, these are not burgeoning, like they are leaders. I mean, I would make an argument that if you wanted to find one of the top Brazil and Latin America, and not here. And, I think, again, Silicon Valley will argue, well, a lot of the technology which is used in mobile payments and in things like neobanking were actually started in America and are American enterprises. But the fact is, in these markets where there was nothing before, there's a great leapfrog going on. And that means that there's really world-class innovation, because we all know on this call, talent is everywhere. And the idea that 2/3 of humanity has access to a supercomputer in their pocket and all the software tools and AI to be able to leverage their businesses in very powerful ways means that we need to look at it on par. You go to Southeast Asia now, and it's just the energy there is astounding, and the talent is astounding, and they're solving very big problems for a region that, in many respects, isn't even a region, right? It's not one country, one sort of land with one language, but multiple cultures and multiple histories and whatever. And you still have companies like Grab and others who've been able to figure out how to develop multiple services across those countries. Right now, you're not going to hear about amazing startups in the because the United States will tend to cover everything in the world from doom or disaster or problems are going forward. But the fact is, amidst great challenges around the world, young people are rising and using their access to software and their innovation and their dissatisfaction that they don't have the services that they think they could have and are being unleashed. And so I really think, in a sentence, what people misunderstand is that they got to get on a plane more, because when you're on the ground, it looks completely and utterly different than what we tend to see even in social media here, let alone in traditional media. And its ramifications bottom up are revolutionary.
Thank you. I think I would be maybe perhaps questioned for having the job that I have if I didn't have a little bit of a conversation on questions of democracy and rights, particularly in the context of some uses of technology, both American commercial and Chinese government technologies that are using surveillance, leveraging all sorts of extractive tools, et cetera. And so I'm curious, because it feels like sometimes we can have two completely separate conversations where people can come to an understanding of what we were just talking about, that there are opportunities in these spaces, there are business chances, these are markets, but that when we get to the discussion on individual rights and liberties or universal concepts of rights and this interconnected internet, that it's almost like it's a completely different conversation, even though certainly open markets depend on interoperability and all of those values. I'm curious, though, since this is where it seems to be that the tension hits, and often where a country walking in talking about rights issues so misses the mark, is in failing to address or acknowledge the very real and human desire for anyone in a country to simply have the most basic opportunities and to participate in a global economy. What is it from the spaces that you are all working in that you think are areas where there would be better opportunity to talk about what are people's innate interests in being able to have control, for instance, over their data, the ability to actually have control over a software stack, agency and access to internet connectivity, et cetera? It seems like these are separate conversations, and I would love to be told that I'm wrong. But I would be really interested in your thoughts with the communities that you're working in. How would you approach those questions so that it isn't taken as either separate or zero-sum discussions? I kind of can throw that open, whoever wants to take that really difficult question first. And if I'm met with awkward silence, then I'll just choose someone. Awkward silence. Great.
I'll go. I'll happily go.
We'll start with
Can I
Elina.
start?
Oh, Chris wanted to say something. I'll jump in right after Chris.
No, you go first.
No, I didn't know. It was actually, I created a competition for the tough answer. This is great. Chris, go ahead.
No. Let Noor.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris. I'll go after you.
I'm now taking my moderator prerogative, and I am forcing Chris to answer.
Okay, just sort of briefly, and you cannot find anyone who's more enthusiastic and pro-democracy than I am, okay? And so I'm reporting and not editorializing when I say this, which is, at least from the lens of the innovation economy overall, what people are looking is for governance that delivers the goods. And if the government delivers the goods, they're actually very focused on building what they're building. And if the governance is not delivering the goods, then you start hearing very different kinds of conversations. Some of the times, as I think pointed out before, maybe about democracy or not democracy, but actually it's often about anti-incumbency or just concerns about goods not being delivered. In my world, goods mean a rule of law and ability to build something and to be able to bring capital to bear and then get capital out if it's successful are the things that I think drive people very much. But there's also, I think, a wariness, an understanding that at the end of the day, if I can be clipped in the way I communicate, I may be clipped, or my regulation may be unpredictable in another way. So you definitely get the push me, pull you in that effect. But I can tell you without any argument that when governance fails in any government to deliver the goods, to be viewed at best as incompetent and maybe as worse as a rigged game, that everything then starts to open up, whether it's on the business and economic side, but certainly on the string you're pulling on about whether democracy. By the way, if democracy doesn't deliver the goods, I think we see a lot of things happening over the world that sort of confirms my overarching thesis.
Thank you. Elina.
Yeah, I mean, I would second what Chris said. It's really about governance legitimacy, government legitimacy in many of these countries that I focus on in Southeast Asia. But I'm going to take a different angle. You know, we often hear a lot of rhetoric about democracy and rights when we're dealing with Western partners. By we, I mean like us in Southeast Asia. And that's fine. I think we should all aspire to greater goals. But I think the reality that we often see and experience is very different, because a lot of the surveillance technologies, for example, there's a lot of talk about China exporting a lot of surveillance tech. But really, China isn't the first one to do this, and has been preceded by many democracies in the West. And the West still continues to export a lot of surveillance tech for very repressive goals. And so I think there is this huge dissonance when it comes to us in Southeast Asia listening to the rhetoric of these ideals on the one hand, and being told that we have a choice between techno-authoritarianism on the one hand and complete freedom and democracy on the other. It just rings very hollow, I'm sorry to say.
May I add just a quick story to that?
Yeah.
I never forget talking to some Latin American entrepreneurs, just happened to be Latin America, and I asked them, all things being equal, if you could get Amazon Cloud, AWS, or if you could have Ali Cloud, and Ali Cloud was 25% less, which would you do? And they cut me off mid-sentence and said, forget 25%. If the customer service is great, and if the service works really, really well, and it's even slightly less, of course we're going to take Ali Cloud. And they could tell I looked shocked by that, as most Americans are shocked by that. And they said, look, trust AWS 100% either. So we just have to be able to rely on service. We know what data we're going to put on any cloud anyway. So we're always a little bit conservative in that way. But I found that answer quite consistent with what Elina just said. And it's something that Americans don't want to hear, but it's worthy of at least understanding it and then reaching conclusions you want to conclude with that data.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to take the unpleasant question?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick.
Excellent.
To also, emphasize the 2 points that have been made by the other 2 panelists, by Chris and Elina. On the point about governance, there's a framework that ASEAN has already come out with on AI, for example. And if you take a look at that framework very closely, there's a lot of concerns over, for example, deepfake, generative AI, and what it can do to society if it's not regulated very well. So there are definitely concerns over the development of technologies that are going to be used for harmful ways, or there are risks associated with that kind of unregulated technological development. So these countries are already, and to the point about agencies, these countries are thinking about how to regulate their own technology development in-house, and also how do they approach collaboration at a broader level too. Both the engaging with the business community and the investment community, but also the research community as well. To Conrad's point, that there are absolute opportunities for people-to-people exchange, university-to-university relationship as well. And in my research, we also looked at research collaboration between researchers in these countries as well. And the research community is an open one, and it benefits from having open access to research that's been published, that's been shared and cited by one another. So there is this tension between how do we maintain that open research community, but also think about ways to minimize harms, right, that are associated with technologies that are developed for harmful purposes. So that's a really challenging, I definitely applaud the people that have to come up with policy around this, in all of these countries, and also, at the international level. So that is still an ongoing challenge that we have to address.
Thank you. Conrad, I both want to give you a chance to answer this question, and since I know you have a hard stop and we are coming close to time, have you kick off what'll be closing comments from all of our panelists, as we have about a minute left. So I'll kick it to you.
So I think my takeaway sums up what Chris said earlier, get on a plane. It's difficult to understand peoples and cultures virtually. And as much as we can engage in this way, I think we are all, to some extent, don't have the complete picture. Africa, in many sense and purposes, is at the nascent stages of developing policies around AI, for example. So rather than staying on the sideline until an adversary or a competing nation comes in, let's be proactive and start engaging now. Rwanda is one of the few countries that has developed an AI policy. We should, as the U.S., be collaborating and being proactive so that our partners in Africa and the global South see us as strategic partners that are helping to co-create, not this top-down approach, but actually co-creating and understanding their context so that we're seen as collaborators as opposed to competitors. So with that, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to serve on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last thoughts, parting thoughts, Elina.
I would add a +2 to that, get on the plane urge. And if you can't do that, then talk to people in the region and from the region. Look, even as a Malaysian who resides in the United States, when I go back to my home country, when I go back to Southeast Asia, I am flummoxed by the level of advances in just over a few months. I feel like a dinosaur entering the digital age with everybody having payments on their phones. And, we still use credit cards here in the United States. So I would say that the landscape is a lot more robust. It's a lot more complex than what we often reduce it to be here in the United States. So talk to people and travel.
Excellent. Parting thoughts, Chris?
I think people have already touched on the important themes. I would just sort of add that it was actually quite a senior person in Singapore said to me last spring, how is the best way for America to compete? And I said, what? And he said, the best way to compete is to compete. And what he means by that is that there's almost this proclivity that government policy should be a fiat in its fear of China and whatever else. And in fact, what government policy should be is unleashing the very strengths that every country has on its own terms. It's true not just of America, but all the countries we're talking to. And I think you can almost predict where countries will be 10 years from now by how the governance is embracing the developments we've talked to and made things happen overall. And I think that's a big lesson for America, as well as it is for every country we've talked about now. And then secondly, things are in flux all the time, as Elina pointed out. And so 5 years ago, China looked at and ascended. I was on the phone with a Chinese entrepreneur earlier this morning who was in a cab ride, and the cab driver was just completely livid about the economy there. You hear stories of young people with 25% unemployment, and the economic slowdown is real, and China seems to want to be open for FDI, but also sending mixed signals to the marketplace. And so all these things are in flux. And I think the greatest way to opportunity is, are you in fact building things that are making a difference in people's lives, whether you're in governance or whether you're an entrepreneur in business? And that tends to be a pretty good North Star in either case.
Thank you. And Noor?
I'll keep it very concise. +3 to getting on the plane, but I would also say go to China as well if you want to understand, if you want to study the country. I've had the opportunity to do field research there to gain a better understanding of how all of these stakeholders actually fit in the entire ecosystem. And I would also say that there's many players in the so-called U.S. and China tech competition. We're not only looking at the U.S. and China. These are not the only players in this space. So that's the reason why we're talking about other important countries as well. So I do want us to keep that in mind.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists, to those of you watching online, to those of you in the room. I believe I now get to give everyone a 10 to 15-minute break, which hopefully makes me a popular moderator. But this was wonderful and really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.